What happens when wealth outweighs crowns or votes? And what happens when the power of the many is ruled by the few? Were those early states truly successful? To understand how these ancient political choices still shape our world today, we have to travel back to roughly 800 BCE. By 800 to 650 BCE, oligarchy had become the dominant political system across much of the Greek world, filling the political space between the decline of monarchies and the eventual rise of tyrannies, and later, democracies. Perhaps the most interesting system to analyze, as it remains one of the most debated political realities in the modern world. And despite its often negative reputation, oligarchy repeatedly appeared, adapted, disappeared, and returned across the Greek world. Prominent examples of oligarchic city-states included Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and Megara. Yet oligarchy also touched Athens, a polis later celebrated for its democracy. Derived from the Greek oligarchia, meaning rule by a few, it was a form of government in which political power was concentrated in the hands of a small and wealthy segment of society. In fact, Aristotle categorized oligarchy as a corrupt form of rule, a system in which political power served the interests of a wealthy few rather than the common good. Aristotle was hardly writing from the perspective of modern human rights. And even by the standards of the ancient world, oligarchy was often viewed as a problematic system of rule. It was repeatedly criticized, challenged, and in many city-states, eventually replaced. So how did Sparta maintain this system for centuries? And how did Athens break away from this form of governance? Let us begin with Sparta. By the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Sparta had grown into one of the most powerful militarized polis in Greece, particularly after the conquest of neighboring Messenia, whose population was largely reduced to Helot status. Helots existed in a condition between freedom and slavery, distinct from later slave systems. They formed a dependent, unfree laboring class, tied to the land and controlled by the Spartan state. From this point onward, Sparta changed remarkably little, unlike many Greek polis that underwent major political transformations. Its political order, military culture, and social structure became deeply tied to the control of its Helot population. Sparta was a closed society, shaped by strict social divisions and rigid control. Spartan society was divided into three main groups. At the top stood the Spartiates, full Spartan citizens from the age of 30, and the military elite of society. They held political rights, trained for war from an early age, and dedicated much of their lives to military service and the affairs of the state. Below them lived the Perioikoi, literally meaning those who dwell around. They were free inhabitants who could own property, trade, work as craftsmen, and fight in Sparta's armies, but held no political rights within Sparta itself. And at the bottom stood the Helots, an unfree laboring population tied to the land and controlled by the Spartan state. Many worked agricultural lands, producing food that sustained Spartan society, while living under permanent subordination and the constant threat of violence. Together, these three groups formed one of the most rigid and unequal social systems in the ancient Greek world. At Sparta's height, full Spartiates likely numbered around 8,000 adult males, or slightly more. Yet over time, their numbers steadily declined, falling to fewer than 1,000 by the time of the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE.
To maintain its oligarchic system, Sparta developed one of the most unusual political structures in the Greek world. Power was carefully divided across several institutions, limiting the influence of any single ruler. At the center of Sparta's government were two hereditary kings, each from a different royal family, one from the Agiad line and one from the Eurypontid line. Their role focused mainly on military leadership and important religious duties. Yet both kings rarely went to war at the same time. While one commanded armies abroad, the other usually remained in Sparta, preserving continuity at home, or whatever stability could mean for a state living in near constant fear of war and rebellion. Political authority, however, did not rest in royal hands alone. Standing alongside the kings was the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. It consisted of 28 men over the age of 60, together with the two kings, making 30 members in total. Its members were elected for life from Sparta's elite citizens, though status and reputation often played an important role in selection, as the council was oligarchic in character. The Gerousia played a central role in government. It prepared laws, advised on major decisions, and served as one of Sparta's highest courts, particularly in serious criminal cases. In practice, this council helped ensure that political power remained in experienced and highly restricted hands. Standing above even the kings were the Ephors. They were 5 officials elected annually from among Spartan citizens. Their authority was extraordinary. They supervised public life, enforced laws, controlled foreign policy, oversaw education, and could even summon kings to account. In practice, the Ephors acted as one of Sparta's strongest checks on royal power. A Spartan king could be fined, put on trial, and in rare cases, even removed from power. Every year, the Ephors also formally declared war on the Helots, a ritual that allowed Spartans to kill rebellious Helots without violating religious customs or being seen as committing a sacred wrongdoing. We will discuss Sparta's methods of oppression and control over the Helot population separately. Yet despite their immense authority, Ephors served for only a single year, though in practice, power still circulated among the same small circle of Spartan elites. At the base of Sparta's political system stood the Apella, the Spartan Citizen Assembly. It consisted of male Spartan citizens, generally over the age of 30. The assembly could vote on major issues such as war, peace, alliances, and the selection of certain officials. But its powers were limited. Unlike the democratic assemblies that later became famous in places such as Athens, debate within the Apella was highly restricted, and proposals largely came from the Gerousia and the Ephors. In practice, Spartan citizens could approve or reject decisions, but had far less influence over shaping them. Yet Sparta's stability came at a cost. The Helots lived under permanent subordination, while even Spartan citizens lived under strict discipline and limited personal freedom. Over time, citizen numbers declined, and Sparta struggled to adapt beyond the rigid system that had once made it strong.
But what did it actually mean to be born in Sparta? The answer depended entirely on who you were born to. In Sparta, birth shaped nearly everything: your education, your rights, your duties, your marriage, your work, and even the degree of freedom you could expect in life. To be born a Spartiate, a Perioikos, or a Helot meant entering 3 very different worlds within the same society. Either a world of strict discipline and duty, or one of limited rights and political exclusion, or a life shaped by labor, control, and permanent subordination. While only a few miles away, its contemporary Athens, despite many inequalities of its own, offered broader opportunities through trade, political participation, education, and private life. A child born to a Spartiate family entered the highest rank of Spartan society, but also one of its most demanding ways of life. Life increasingly belonged to the state.
One story frequently associated with Sparta claims that newborns were inspected shortly after birth, and those judged physically weak may have faced abandonment. Yet the evidence remains debated, relies heavily on later sources such as Plutarch, and historians continue to disagree over how systematically such practices were actually carried out.
At around the age of 7, Spartan boys were typically taken from their families and entered the Agoge, a state-organized system of education, discipline, and military training. The process was supervised by Spartan officials, especially the paidonomos, a magistrate responsible for overseeing boys' education, discipline, and conduct. Boys lived and trained together in age groups, supervised by older youths known as arenes and adult officials. They trained physically, learned endurance, obedience, military skills, music, dance, and survival techniques, while hardship itself became part of education. Ancient accounts describe limited clothing, strict discipline, sparse food, and even encouragement to steal, though punishment followed if one was caught, not necessarily for theft itself but for failure. Academic education appears to have remained relatively basic. They likely learned reading, writing, and counting, but far less emphasis was placed on broader intellectual subjects, especially when compared to democratic Athens of the classical period. Spartan oligarchy did not appear to place great value on intellectual education. The priorities of the state lay in loyalty to the collective, simply creating disciplined and loyal citizens. At around 20, military service became central to adult life, though full political rights generally came only around the age of 30. Marriage was permitted earlier, yet even married Spartan men had to continue living in military barracks and spend much of their lives with fellow soldiers, at least until reaching around the age of 30. Then they could more fully join family life.
Life for Spartan women followed a very different path. Unlike in many other Greek polis, women in Sparta received physical training from an early age, including exercise, running, and athletic competition. The state believed strong women would give birth to strong children. They participated in religious festivals and public rituals, but political rights remained out of reach. Like much of Spartan society, women's lives were also shaped by the priorities of the state. Marriage in Sparta was closely connected to citizenship. Spartan men and women generally married within the citizen class, helping preserve the citizen community and future generations.
To be born a Helot meant entering the lowest rank of Spartan society and one of the harshest ways of life. They were descendants of conquered populations, especially from Messenia, and their status was inherited at birth. Most Helots were tied to the land and compelled to work it, producing food that sustained the Spartan state. We will describe how this was managed when we talk about ownership rights. Unlike slaves in some other societies, Helots were not usually bought and sold individually, but remained bound to the land under Spartan control. They could form families and communities of their own, yet lived under permanent subordination and the constant threat of punishment or violence. Periodic repression, surveillance, and fear of revolt became central features of Spartan rule. Yet, despite harsh conditions, Helots formed the agricultural foundation of Sparta, making the entire Spartan system possible.
But to be born a Perioikos meant living a life between privilege and subordination. The Perioikoi were free inhabitants living in towns and communities surrounding Sparta, but remained outside full Spartan citizenship. They could own limited property, marry freely, manage businesses, and participate in trade and craftsmanship. Many worked as craftsmen, merchants, metalworkers, and shipbuilders, helping sustain much of Sparta's economy. They had no political rights in Sparta, they could not participate in Spartan government, and had little influence over the state that governed them. Military service, however, remained part of life, and Perioikoi fought alongside Spartan armies when called upon. In many ways, they lived with greater personal freedom than Spartiates, but without the privileges of citizenship. Sparta's social order extended far beyond politics, shaping how people ate, spoke, behaved, and understood their place in society.
Spartan life revolved around communal dining groups known as Syssitia, where adult male citizens regularly ate together, and contribution to these common messes formed an important condition of citizenship. These meals reinforced loyalty, discipline, and social cohesion, and if a Spartan could no longer contribute food, he could lose his status as a full citizen. The meals themselves were simple by design. Spartans typically ate bread, barley, cheese, figs, olives, and wine, while meat was consumed more occasionally. Ancient sources also mention a famous dish known as black broth, or melos zomos, a mixture said to contain pork blood, pig's legs, salt, and vinegar. Whether loved or endured, it became one of the most enduring symbols of Spartan simplicity.
Spartan women were not allowed to attend Syssitia, but they would participate in athletic competitions, religious festivals, public dances, and choral performances, activities that gave them a more visible presence in public life than many women elsewhere in Greece. Yet their role remained defined by Spartan priorities, family, religion, and the continuation of the citizen community.
Wealth and luxury were viewed with suspicion in Sparta. At least in principle, simplicity was admired far more than displays of personal success and luxury, though historians continue to debate how consistently these ideals were followed in practice. The same preference for restraint appeared in the way Spartans spoke. They became famous for their brief and often sharp manner of expression, saying only what was necessary and little more. This reputation became so closely associated with Sparta that the term Laconic speech survives to this day, named after Laconia, the region of Sparta itself. Yet it is worth noting that the idea of Spartans universally speaking in short sentences comes largely from ancient literary tradition. The reputation itself is well attested, but how closely it reflected everyday speech across Spartan society is harder to determine. Among the most controversial institutions associated with Sparta was the Krypteia. Described by several ancient authors, it appears to have involved selected young Spartiates operating in secret, often at night and away from the supervision of ordinary society. Its exact purpose remains debated. Some historians view it as a form of military training or initiation, while others see it as a mechanism for monitoring and intimidating the Helot population. According to Plutarch's description of Spartan customs, participants were sent into the countryside with minimal supplies, expected to survive on their own through stealth, endurance, and resourcefulness. They reportedly traveled by night, remained concealed during the day, and avoided detection whenever possible. Plutarch and Aristotle also claim that members of the Krypteia targeted Helots considered dangerous or rebellious, though historians continue to debate how regularly such actions occurred and how much later authors may have exaggerated them. If these accounts are broadly accurate, the Krypteia served not only as a test of survival and discipline, but also as a reminder of Spartan control over the much larger Helot population. It also illustrates the degree to which coercion and the threat of violence may have been woven into the maintenance of Spartan society itself.
Land formed the foundation of wealth in Sparta. In theory, citizen families were expected to possess land sufficient to support their obligations to the state, while much of the agricultural work was performed by Helots.
According to Spartan tradition, conquered lands were divided into hereditary land allotments known as kleroi, assigned to citizen families. The Helots who lived on these lands remained attached to them and were compelled to work for the benefit of the Spartan landholders. They were required to surrender part of their harvest, while keeping the remainder to support themselves and their families. Rather than being bought and sold individually, they were generally transferred together with the land itself. There are claims that Sparta was divided into around 9,000 citizen allotments, or kleroi, though modern historians continue to debate whether such figures ever reflected historical reality.
Over time, however, land and wealth became increasingly concentrated in fewer hands. Aristotle complained that large amounts of property had accumulated within a relatively small number of families. Spartan women could also inherit and own property, and by the classical period controlled a significant share of Spartan wealth. But, as wealth became more unevenly distributed, fewer citizens could meet the economic requirements associated with full citizenship, contributing to the long-term decline of the Spartiate population.
Sparta was not an open society. Unlike many Greek polis that relied heavily on trade, immigration, and interaction with foreigners, Sparta generally remained cautious toward outside influences. Foreign visitors could be viewed with suspicion, and Spartans themselves were sometimes prohibited from traveling abroad without permission. This policy, known in later sources as Xene-lasia, a practice involving the expulsion or exclusion of foreigners from Sparta, was intended to limit foreign influences that might challenge Spartan customs and social order. Whether these restrictions were always enforced consistently remains debated, but the broader tendency towards social isolation is well documented.
By the 4th century BCE, Sparta faced a growing crisis. The number of full citizens had declined dramatically, while land and wealth became concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. As the number of citizens able to meet the economic requirements of citizenship continued to shrink, Sparta struggled to sustain the citizen body on which its political and military system depended. At the same time, the state remained heavily dependent on the labour of the much larger Helot population, a relationship that required constant control and coercion. Several reform efforts attempted to reverse the decline, most notably under Kings Agis IV and Cleomenes III. Their proposals included redistributing land, reducing economic inequality, and expanding the shrinking citizen body in an effort to restore Sparta's traditional strength. But the underlying problems proved difficult to solve.
The decisive turning point came after Sparta's defeat at Leuctra in 371 BCE, when it lost control of Messenia and much of the economic foundation that had sustained its society for centuries. Although Sparta survived as a city for centuries afterward, the state never recovered its losses. After unsuccessful reform attempts and continued decline, Sparta was incorporated into the Achaean League in 192 BCE, bringing an end to its long history as an independent oligarchic state. In the end, Sparta was not alone. Most Greek oligarchies eventually collapsed, transformed, or were absorbed into larger political systems, leaving behind institutions and ideas that continued to influence political thought long after the city-states themselves disappeared. While Sparta struggled to preserve the rule of the few, another Greek polis was moving in a very different direction. Sparta became the most famous oligarchy of the ancient Greek world. Athens would become its most famous democratic rival. And it is there that the story of democracy begins.